Um, I am pleased to welcome you all to our SSK Global Marxism Online Talks. I am Guhyeon, a researcher of the SSK Research Cluster at Gyeongsang National University. First of all, thank you for your obsession to our invitation, Professor Martin Hart-Landsberg. This is the third talk of GMOT's third round. Professor Martin Hart-Landsberg of Lewis and Clark College will give a presentation on the topic Planning and Politics, World War II Lessons for a Green New Deal. His talk will draw on material from the following two articles, Realizing a Green New Deal, Lessons from World War II, and The Green New Deal and the State, Lessons from World War II. You can check the online links to these two papers in the chat window. The presentation time is 1 hour, followed by 30 minutes of discussion. And now, Professor Hart-Landsberg.
Thank you. I want to say again how much I appreciate the invitation to participate in this series that has so many very thoughtful people. And I thank you for the hard work I know that goes into organizing these talks. So the title of the talk, as said, was The Planning and Politics of Transformation, World War II Lessons for a Green New Deal. And before I get to the heart of the talk, which is the way in which the transformation took place and what lessons, I want to sort of talk very briefly and introduce the talk by sharing why I think the topic is so important. The Green New Deal has become kind of a rallying cry for activists in many countries. I know Korea has its Green New Deal. European Union has a Green New Deal. Certainly the US has a Green New Deal. And I think the use of the 1930s New Deal as a framing for the movement in the United States shows its continuing importance in the American public imagination. And I think it's understandable why. As growing numbers of people come to recognize that swift and decisive state action will be needed to avert a climate catastrophe, it's understandable that many people look back to the New Deal for hope that meaningful change is possible. Popular understanding of the New Deal in the United States largely celebrates President Franklin Roosevelt as the initiator of system-changing reforms that enabled the US to emerge from the Depression with a new and more egalitarian economy. In reality, Roosevelt's most praised reforms were taken to head off far more radical changes being promoted by left organizers, especially those in the Communist Party. Moreover, it was the defense buildup and the wartime mobilization that followed that finally succeeded, not New Deal programs, in lifting the US economy out of the Depression. That said, there is much that Green New Deal activists can learn from a study of the New Deal experience, perhaps most importantly about organizing and movement building strategies. However, when it comes to the economic and political challenges involved in planning and advancing a Green New Deal style system-wide transformation, it's my argument that it is the wartime economic conversion experience that deserves our attention. To this point, there's really no actual Green New Deal legislation in the United States that one can rally around. Rather, there are many different Green New Deal proposals, each authored by a different political tendencies. Most of them include very similar demands and policies. For example, an end to the exploration, production, and use of fossil fuel, the rapid expansion and the production use of clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy, retrofitting of existing buildings, transformation of the transportation system, a massive program of public works to modernize the country's infrastructure and expand green manufacturing, the closure of environmentally destructive industries, support for localized small-scale eco-friendly farming, universal access to high-quality health care, affordable and safe housing, clean water, air, and healthy and affordable food, and access to nature. As worthy as this list is, it's only a list. And as such, it does very little to help activists organizing around one or more of these demands develop a sense of how different campaigns might connect or conflict as they develop, or even more importantly, the kind of agencies and mechanisms that will be needed to actually plan and drive the desired system-wide change in the US political economy. Studying the World War II experience can not only build confidence that a rapid Green New Deal style transformation is possible, it can also help us appreciate in concrete terms the complex economic relationships between different sectors of our economy and the tensions that can be expected to arise as we seek to advance the restructuring. The resulting insights can encourage and even inform the work required to build the strong cross-issue alliances that will be needed for success. The World War II experience also illuminates the critical role the state can be expected to play. The wartime transformation was not only possible because of the wartime transformation was only possible because of an expansion of state capacities that included the creation of new planning bodies and agencies with the authority to independently finance the expansion of new factories, needed industries, plant and equipment, to allocate scarce privately produced goods and services, to organize the mass training of workers for new activities and support their relocation to new geographic areas with the construction of new housing and related social infrastructure, and the ability to force some non-essential heavy users of resources to end their production and others to shift their activities to the production of new goods and services. Analyzing and evaluating this experience can help us begin to envision new ways to organize and use public power consistent with our vision of a new, more egalitarian and solidaristic political economy. Finally, studying the World War II experience can also help us prepare for the heightened class warfare that can be expected to accompany the transformation. During the war, Big Capital aggressively and mostly successfully built alliances with the state and military that ensured its interests were taken into account during the war and during the planning for peacetime reconversion. As a result, it was able to emerge from the war in a stronger position, both economically and ideologically. Studying the way capital used its privileged ownership position during this period can alert us to the kinds of challenges we're likely to face as we push to build a new economy. So with this as background, I want to now turn to the heart of my presentation. What follows, I will briefly highlight the enormity and speed of the wartime transformation. And then I will describe in some detail the evolution and evaluate the effectiveness of the most important public agencies and policies used to achieve it. Finally, I'll end with a brief discussion of the relevance of this conversion experience to our efforts to advance a Green New Deal style transformation of the US economy. So let me start with the rapidity and the accomplishments of the transformation. Central to the World War II era conversion from a civilian-oriented to a military-oriented economy was the enormous and rapid expansion in military spending over the years 1940 to 1943. Military spending grew by an incredible 270% in 1941, 260% in 1942, and 100% in 1943. As a consequence, military spending as a share of GDP rose from 1.6% in 1940 to 32.2% in 1943. That year, federal spending hit a record high of 46.6% of GDP. As one historian summarizes the period, he said, by the end of 1943, the United States had won the battle of production at home. It could manufacture and supply the tools of war for itself and its allies at needed levels. Although this experience is often celebrated as a production miracle, it was not. For example, there was little difference between the years 1921 and 1924 and 1941 and 1944 in the growth of industrial production or in the growth of real gross non-farm product. Placing the US in the international experience reinforces this point. If you use the distribution of world manufacturing production in the period 1926 to 29 as a reference point, the US in the peak year in 1944 was producing munitions at almost exactly the same level it should have been. The explanation for these two different views of the period is that the transformation involved far more than an increase in military spending. There was also the curtailment or outright suppression of the production of many industries, the rationing of limited supplies of many goods, and the conversion of many industries from civilian to military production. Between 1940 and 1944, the total production of non-war goods and services actually fell by close to 10%. So the tremendous gains in US military production were achieved and in a relatively short period of time, not because of some impossible to repeat production miracle, but because a government-directed mobilization succeeded in fully employing the country's resources while shifting their use from civilian to military production. So now what I want to do is turn to actually the question of how did the US do this? And to structure my presentation, I'm going to talk about the development and operation of the three prime mobilization agencies that were central to the achievement: the National Defense Advisory Commission, the Office of Production Management, and then the War Production Board. So I'm going to start with the National Defense Advisory Commission. Roosevelt was faced with very strong resistance to getting involved in not only World War II, but planning for the war. There was a lot of isolationist beliefs by many people in Congress and among the population. It wasn't until Germany's rapid invasions of Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and Luxembourg in May 1940 that the political moment shifted, bringing an increase in popular sentiment in favor of action to support England and strengthen the US military in preparation for possible war. Rather than seek congressional approval for a new mobilization agency, Roosevelt decided to activate an already existing World War I era agency, the National Defense Advisory Commission, or NDAC. The NDAC, in sharp contrast to the World War I corporate-run War Industries Board, had no supreme leader, limited powers, and included members representing a range of economic and social concerns. It was a complex agency. It was organized around 7 divisions, each with its own appointed head. There was an industrial production division, industrial materials division, a labor division, price stabilization, farm products, transportation, and consumer protection. There was no overall administrative hierarchy, so that coordination, such that it was, had to be achieved through the work of a liaison committee staffed by representatives from each division that met weekly. The NDAC's primary charge was to help business produce the goods and services needed by the military. And because of its focus, its activities soon came to be dominated by the work of just 2 of the divisions: the Industrial Production Division, which was led by the man who had been president of General Motors Corporation, and the Industrial Materials Division, which was led by a man who was the board chairman of the United States Steel Corporation. The other divisions were largely ignored by industry leaders and were quickly sidelined. The Industrial Production Division was tasked with facilitating the manufacture of munitions not normally produced by the economy and organized into 8 sections. The most important were aircraft, ammunition and light ordnance, and tanks, trucks, and tractors. Each section had its own appointed head, typically what was called a $1-a-year man, who remained employed by one of the firms whose production was to be encouraged by the section and worked for the government for only $1, even while drawing their full salary from the company that they had left. Section heads generally relied on industry advisory committees as well as trade association officials to help them with their work. The Industrial Materials Division served the same function for industrial materials. It was divided into 3 main subdivisions. The first was mining and mineral products, which was further divided into sections representing products such as iron and steel, copper, aluminum, and tin. Then the next subdivision covered agricultural and forest products, which was further divided into textile, leather, paper, rubber, and the like. and the third subdivision covered chemical and allied products, divided into sections for petroleum and nitrogen. These subdivisions and their sections also made use of dollar-a-year men, industry advisory committees, and trade association officials. In fact, in many cases, trade association officials who were hired by industries were placed in charge of the sections that were responsible for the industries they were paid to represent. The most important change to the NDAC came in June 1940. The NDAC was started in May with the creation of the Office of Coordination of National Defense Purchases. Donald Nelson, who was a former vice president of Sears, Roebuck and Company, a big retail business, was appointed as head. His job was to ensure good communications and working relationships between the NDAC and the military. So his office worked to monitor and standardize contracts, develop simplified product specifications to enlarge the pool of potential suppliers, and encourage distributive buying practices to spread orders among multiple suppliers and promote the use of negotiated contracts over competitive bidding. The NDAC actually proved to be pretty ineffective as a mobilization agency for three reasons. First, the military proved unable to translate its weapons needs into the goods required for their production. Second, many of the businesses that were central to the work of the NDAC's two main divisions were reluctant to either convert from civilian to military production or to expand their capacity to satisfy both markets. And finally, with no authority or powers of compliance, the NDAC found it difficult to develop an overall production plan or overcome corporate and military resistance. So let me go through each of those quickly. As far as the military procurement situation, each military branch, which was Army, Air Force, and Navy, had its own procurement agencies who would go out and bid for the things that they needed. And they had their own purchasing systems, and they had their own contractor relationships. It was the job of the Army Navy Munitions Board to aggregate all the branch needs and negotiate with the NDAC and its various divisions over how to satisfy what the procurement agencies needed. But the procurement agencies, operating in terms of weapons and troop numbers, had no knowledge of the materials they needed to be produced to get what they wanted. How much steel was in a tank, for example. They had no way of translating what that they needed weapons-wise into materials. As a result, the Army Navy Munitions Board was unable to offer much guidance about the military's immediate and long-term needs in terms of finished products and their required components, parts, and materials. And the fact that the military was continually working to improve its weapons meant that its material requirements were continually changing, adding a further complication. What about corporate resistance? Most corporations were reluctant to expand their facilities to accommodate growing defense needs. Most of the corporations in the industrial production division already had working relations with the military and were happy to sell to them. But the post-World War I experience left them leery of investing in new plant and equipment. The military had terminated their contracts almost immediately at the end of World War I with no compensation for what became overbuilt plants and unsold inventories. As a consequence, corporations were now demanding government-provided financial inducements or guarantees to protect them against the uncertainties surrounding the mobilization. Other firms, primarily those that fell under the jurisdiction of the materials division, were outright opposed to expansion. Their opposition caused few problems during most of the 1940s because the economy was still coming out of the Depression and there was a lot of slack. But by the end of 1940, shortages of a number of materials were beginning to affect negatively the military buildup. Aluminum, for example, is a big case of this. There was one firm that monopolized aluminum production, that was Alcoa, and it refused to expand its productive capacity, even though the lack of aluminum was making it impossible to produce aircraft. Moreover, the head of the Industrial Materials Division, who came from US Steel, backed the industry and refused to force it to do what the military needed. A similar situation existed with steel. Steel executives saying no need for expanding capacity all the time when there was a lack of steel, which kept shipbuilding and railroad car manufacturing from fulfilling the orders. Now, a lot of these shortages could have been managed if the large producers of consumer durables had responded positively to NDAC requests that they reduce their production or convert to military production and free up the resources. But most were enjoying profits for the first time in years, and they refused to give up their markets. The automobile industry, which was a major user of raw materials, for example, refused to reduce production, refused to end model changes, and continued, in fact, boosting its production. Finally, the other problem with the NDAC was that although the NDAC was charged with approving all military procurement contracts to ensure there would be sufficient capacity in the economy and no conflicts of interest in the awarding of contracts and fair contractual terms, it didn't have the power or authority to make the military respond to that. So what would happen is that the Army or the Navy would negotiate its own terms of contract and then turn them over to the NDAC at the last moment, leaving the NDAC absolutely no option but to approve them. The leading firms that anchored the NDAC generally were happy to work with the military like this, since they were also opposed to giving greater authority of the government over their activity. And the alliance was further tightened because the military was very happy to give all their contracts to the leading firms, so it was kind of a closed loop. One of the difficulties here was that the military demand was growing very rapidly and much faster than the supply of key materials and machines. So what happened was there was a growing shortage. And as a consequence, the military contractors who were producing for the military couldn't get what they needed. And so the NDAC tried to help the military with a priority system to say, you know, where should steel go? Where should ball bearings go? How do we organize this? But even though Roosevelt established a priorities board under the NDAC to help them do it, the military basically ignored it. And the result was there was all sorts of chaos where the military was continuing to demand things even beyond what the economy could produce. So the result was a breakdown in the priority system. And as a result, firms started hoarding and the military buildup was set back. So to summarize, one of the NDAC's greatest achievement was its work in support of two initiatives that were designed to overcome the corporate reluctance to invest. The NDAC, especially its production decision, won congressional approval of two things. One was an accelerated depreciation schedule, and the second was the creation of a new federal agency, the Defense Plant Corporation, that had the power to directly finance new plant construction. And these two initiatives eventually helped jumpstart the industrial expansion, particularly in the aircraft industry, shipbuilding, ship repair, machine tool industry. The accelerated depreciation schedule meant that firms could reduce their taxes by investing in new plant and equipment. And that resulted in about $6 billion of new investment, some 20% of all the investment during the war. But the Defense Plant Corporation was the most important thing. Congress had given the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was from the 1930s, the authority to create new subcorporations. And one of them was the Defense Plant Corporation. And the Defense Plant Corporation could, in fact, take whatever money it needed from the Treasury to invest in building new companies. And what it did, it essentially would decide what areas of the economy needed to expand. It would pay for the actual construction. It would own the facilities, but it would plan the construction and then lease the facilities for a minimal fee to a predetermined contractor who would operate them. The Defense Plant Corporation eventually financed and owned 1/3 of all the plant and equipment built during the war. So by the end of the war, public ownership was about 15% of the country's total industrial capacity. So there were movements forward, certainly an investment but the shortages, the lack of a priority system all meant chaos. And by the end of 1940, the military production was not moving ahead. There were all these kinds of problems. So Roosevelt decided to replace it with the new mobilization agency called the Office of Production Management. The military still wanted Roosevelt to create a really tight, centralized body that would be very responsive to it, and Roosevelt still resisted, but he compromised. He created, in the Office of Production Management, a central body that had as its head the same person who had been in charge of the industrial production from General Motors. And as his vice chair, he appointed Sidney Hillman, who was president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers from Labor. And then the two others were from the Secretaries of Navy and Secretaries of War. The operating structure was also streamlined. All the divisions that were not central to production were essentially dropped. But while this was kind of an improvement, a little more central of a tight decision-making body, the Office of Production Management continued to have its own problems. So what was the structure? The OPM had 4 operating divisions: the production division, the purchasing division, the priorities division, and the labor division, although that was quickly marginalized. With all the business people running these things, they were very uninterested in what was happening to labor and refused to really work with unions at all. The production division now had 3 branches, formerly called sections. All the industries that were under the materials division was 1 branch. Another covered aircraft, ordnance, and tools. The third had ships, construction, and supplies. So all the industries that were of the greatest importance to the military were put under 1 division. The production division worked to ensure the supply of critical goods was adequate. It continued to try and work with boosting investment in plant and equipment. The purchasing division was put in charge of, again, coordinating all Army and Navy buying, contracting, and construction. It was given the power to authorize all of those kinds of things. And it looked like there would be more centralization and more control, but this really isn't what happened. The purchasing division, which was supposed to okay and help with allocation, really didn't have the staff to control things. And the military would continue to just, all the different branches would continue to just demand goods and services without any care for whether the economy could produce them or whether they were duplicating their own demands. And so there was again, a lot of chaos. Moreover, the head of General Motors, who was put in charge of OPM, was not a particularly good leader. And the 2 head of the Army and the head of the Navy didn't really care for having government involvement. From their point of view, the military was running this, and they weren't particularly interested in working with the council. So the council did not have very much power. It didn't do very successful overall planning. What it did do, though, was continue the work of expanding the plant and equipment of the economy, mostly because of the Defense Plant Corporation. The construction spending for defense grew from $6 billion in 1940 to $16.7 billion in 1941. But again, by April of 1941, the shortages of materials were continuing to grow, more delays in fulfilling defense orders, and even some shutdowns in actual production because parts and equipment could not be obtained. The priorities division faced 2 challenges in dealing with these shortages. The first was businesses continued to oppose OPM directives. Despite the toll shortages were taking, corporations, many of them, still refused to curtail or convert their operations. Automobile industry refused to change what it was doing. Steel firms still continued to refuse to change what they were doing. In many cases, rejecting military contract offers because they would rather support their normal civilian purchasers, where the economy was now rolling and it was very profitable. So despite pressure from the president and demands from the OPM, key industries refused to respond. The other was the military's lack of discipline and strategic focus. The military continued to flood the purchasing division with requests and the priority division with priority applications at a rate which overwhelmed the sections, the primary priority committees, and the industry advisory committees. So again, chaotic approval and priority rating process. But the bigger problem was that the military made its requests with no awareness of or concern for the economy's overall supply limitations. Oftentimes, its demand for specific goods was greater than their total available supply. To try and deal with this, and I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that the planning process evolved. It evolved in large part because it had to deal with corporate resistance and military resistance. And so the question is, how does the government begin to gain control over these things? So the OPM, Office of Production Management, reorganized itself, reorganized all the divisions. And it also tried to reduce the number and influence of the dollar-a-year men who, often representing these sections, sided with the companies more than the mobilization agency itself. But they were very desperate to try and win the business class over to help with the mobilization. So they were reluctant to actually get rid of them. And in fact, as the mobilization grew, over 1941, the number of dollar-a-year men grew by 40% because there were now more sections and more subsections as more of the economy is being mobilized. The OPM also attempted to improve its priority system with more complex designations, and it began allocating processes. So if everybody asked for certain goods and there weren't enough of them, the OPM began to turn to its various divisions to say who should get them, so that they would be organized in a way that wouldn't just be random and wouldn't lead to stockpiling. The last big change of the OPM was in August and September of 1941. And of course, the US doesn't enter the war till December of 41. So the US mobilization is still ongoing to build up defense capacities. Two big changes. First was, as the process is growing, it's harder to say what's military related and what isn't, and to separate the military from the civilian economy. So Roosevelt gave the OPM authority over the entire economy, and a new division was created called the Civilian Supply Division, which was given responsibility for all industries producing 50% or less for the defense program, which included almost all the major consumer durable goods industries. And there was, at the same time, there was a shuffling of other industries again, and the appointment of new division leaders who were less beholden to the corporations. But probably the most important thing was that Roosevelt created what was called the Supply Priorities and Allocation Board, or SPAB. And what Roosevelt did was he packed that board with people who were favorable to him. It included people like the Vice President, Harold Wallace, Harry Hopkins, who was a Roosevelt special assistant, Leon Henderson, and Donald Nelson. And he made sure that that board would be beholden to the mobilization and not industries. And with the SPAB then giving orders, it ordered the OPM to start shutting down activities that weren't essential. And so the OPM halted all private and public construction for civilian activities that wasn't considered essential. And it began to order automobiles, refrigerators, domestic laundry equipment makers, vacuum clean makers, metal office furniture and equipment makers, all to either curtail or terminate its production. Even more importantly, it turned to the work of the Bureau of Research and Statistics, and economists were very important in this mobilization process. And it said to the Bureau of Research and Statistics, you've got to figure out how much the economy can produce in line with what the military needs. Roosevelt had told the military, this is in September of 1941, that in 2 years, by September of 43, it had to have full capacity materials and components and labor hours and dollar amounts. And they published in November what they called a victory program. And the Bureau concluded that the victory program would require an enormous amount of spending over the 2 years, double what the military was saying it wanted to spend over the next 2 years. And the Bureau was convinced that the economy couldn't support this kind of large spending increase. But it said it could probably meet 2/3 of it by September of 43, the target date, and the rest of it by the spring of 44. So it came up with a target as to what it thought the economy could actually measure. And that happened right before Pearl Harbor and the US entry into the war. So by the time the war started, the US finally had a mobilization agency with responsibility for the entire economy, enhanced powers to direct civilian production, and a sense of the economic capacities of the country that could be used to mobilize and fight the war. Once the US entered the war, Roosevelt changed the agency again and created something called the War Production Board. And he asked Nelson, who had been part of all these prior mobilization agencies, to head it. And it was structured around 6 different agencies. And again, all the industries kind of got reshaped once more. The War Production Board continued to rely on the work of dollar-a-year men, and their number grew from between January and December of 1942. The number grew from 310 to 805. And that's because all the industries now, there were like 43 industries and 16 commodity producers, all had their own little war production boards, their own committees, their own subcommittees, everything trying to plan. So what were the challenges that the War Production Board faced? The first was curtail civilian production to free up resources for the military. The second was expand the economy's production capacity. The third was to stabilize the priority allocation system. And the last was to bring military procurement into line with the productive capacity of the economy. So the first thing they really faced was how to get non-essential producers to stop producing. And with greater authority, they actually shut down auto production, shut down other areas of civilian production to open up the materials that were needed for war production. So that was pretty straightforward. As far as facilities expansion, again, the Defense Plant Corporation was really critical. In 1942, the facilities expansion reached about 8.7 billion, which is equal to 1/3 of all the new investments over the period June 1940 to 1944. Just to give you an idea, this is a government agency that could have its own money, decide on plants, decide where they go, choose a contractor, own the plant, own the facility, have the contractor manage it under government control. By the end of the war, the Defense Plant Corporation owned 96% of the capacity of the synthetic rubber industry, 90% of magnesium metal, 71% of aircraft and aircraft engines, 58% of the aluminum metal industry, sizable investments in iron and steel, aviation, gasoline, ordnance, machine tools, transportation, all sorts of things. So that was pretty significant. The two biggest challenges now were allocation and scheduling. And because the military continued to demand things greater than what the economy could produce, particularly of metals, the problem was how to make sure they got to the right companies in the right time. So Nelson brought in 2 specialists. One is a man named Eberstadt to work on production system, particular components. What Eberstadt did was he had authority over all the industries. And what he did is he created a focus on about 16 a plan that would say what metals they're going to need for the upcoming year and what months. And the claimants got that because they went to their prime contractors and said, okay, if you're going to produce the goods we need, what metals do you need over what period of time? And then this organization under Eberstadt would bring it all together, go to the industry divisions and say, okay, how much steel will the economy produce? How many machine tools would it produce? And then they'd look at what the demands are. And if the capacity was less than, they'd go back to the claimants and say, you can only have 3/4 of what you wanted. You go tell your prime contractors and you distribute what you got to them and reorganize production in line with this. And by doing this, they began to bring rationality to the process. So now materials were going not just willy-nilly, but to end users. The Wilson, who was put in charge of trying to get the production process rolling smoothly, created something called the Production Executive Committee, which included the Army, Air Force, Navy, Naval Bureau of Aeronautics, Maritime Commission, and Eberstadt. And what he did is he told every military procurement agency for each service to create a central body and have agents in each one of the critical industries that the military needed, and then look at their procurements, share them with their central body. The central body would then share them with this Production Executive Committee, and they would review them to see whether they made sense. When should the materials be delivered to which firm and when to another firm, depending on their production schedule. And they focused on components, from ball bearings to turbines to all sorts of the various parts and components. And they did something like what Eberhard did for materials. They focused on a few critical ones, and they got the procurement agencies to say what they wanted and when, and who their contractors were, and they would make sure that they were directed where they should go. Again, it began to bring order to this and allowed the 1942 massive increase in military production. But the key was still getting control over the military itself. The military continued to say, we want what we want, and the economy has to respond. And so what Nelson did is he tasked a planning committee under him, again, another group of economists, to see what the US economy could actually produce relative to what the military was demanding. And he hired an economist named Simon Kuznets, who's very famous in the US as a planner. And Kuznets did a feasibility study, and he concluded that the military's demands were just so far out of line that they were making it impossible to really allocate and prioritize appropriately. And so he said what has to happen is that the military has to reduce its demands in line with the economy. And the military resisted, particularly the Army. And this battle went on back and forth for several months until finally in late 1942, there was a huge meeting with all the members from the War Production Board and all the members for the military. Actually, this was in October 42. And when meetings were normally an hour, this went on for like 3 hours. And the Army and Kuznets and the planners screamed and yelled at each other. The next day, the secretary of the Army, basically, of the War Department, called up the Army and said, we're wrong, we've got to adjust appropriately. And so the Army finally backed down and reduced its demands. And that process meant that the amount of demands from the military was now more in line with the economy. The allocation systems, the priority systems, the expansion of investment all began to mean by the end of 43, the US economy was really moving rapidly and strongly, producing what it needed to produce. The last kind of struggle was behind the scenes and political. And it's important to say, and then I'm going to wrap up and talk about what the implications of some of these things are. And that is that Nelson, who was in charge of the War Production Board, had essentially created two power centers: Eberstadt, who was running allocation systems for materials, and Wilson, who was running in essentially allocations of components. And as materials sort of fell into line more, the components were more difficult and seen as more important. But who had the industry groups that were brought into play to determine how the allocations and priorities should go? Most of them were Eberstadt. And Wilson said, I need more of them. My job is more important. And the two groups began to fight. Behind the scenes, the military hated Nelson. They hated that they had been brought to bear. They hated the planning division, and they wanted Roosevelt to fire Nelson. Nelson got wind that Roosevelt was going to fire him, and he thought it was going to be because Eberstadt was going to be made the head of the War Production Board, because Eberstadt had been chairman of the Army Navy Munitions Board, so had a background in the military. So when Nelson got wind that Roosevelt was going to fire him, although it wasn't for Eberstadt, it was for someone else, he fired Eberstadt and elevated Wilson to take over all that planning that had previously been divided, and essentially made Wilson the most powerful person in the War Production Board. And Wilson was running the production committee with just him and members of the military. And he ran it essentially as a collegial body. And so that meant that the military was now dominant of how the War Production Board would run. And Wilson was totally on board, because he felt if we're fighting a war, the military should be key. The military was in league closely with the corporations. The corporations didn't like labor and kept trying to expand and extend their influence. And Wilson also was very conservative with corporations. And so what you had then is, from 43 on to the end of the war, a very tight alliance between the corporations and the military about how to run the economy. And this continued on until about 1944, when both Nelson and Wilson left the War Production Board, and they were replaced by someone else who served as chair until the board was ended in November 1945. So that's kind of the story and the kind of evolution. So what are the lessons that we can get from this complicated history? First, I think it demonstrates the feasibility of a rapid system-wide conversion of the US economy. The US did it. It also shows the critical importance of state planning, public financing and ownership, and state direction of economic activity for achieving such a conversion. There's no way it could have happened without the ability to actually finance industries, decide where plant would go, make allocation decisions, make priority decisions, decide when industry should be closed down. It also shows the need for flexibility, both in planning structures and mobilization policies. And it highlights the tensions and resistance that a conversion process generates, especially from dominant corporations, who were very resistant to expand, and also very resistant to allowing labor to play a role in deciding how production should be satisfied. Now, I do not mean to argue that the World War II era economic transformation can serve as sort of a model for us. Obviously, there are lots of differences in the times and the aims of the two transformations. There's some reasons, I would say 3, to imagine that it will be easier to accomplish a Green New Deal style transformation than the World War II era transformation. And here are the 3. One is the World War II transformation had to be quickly achieved to prepare for and then fight an all-out war. By contrast, although climate events are growing in number and severity, our transformation doesn't have to be as rapid, which should make it easier to manage. The second is that the biggest challenge facing mobilization authorities during World War II was the military's separate and superior status. The military had the right to make priorities. The military had the ability to say what it wanted. The government agencies had to essentially respond to what the military had to say. But we don't have this self-contained institution like that, like the military, for us when we think about planning. Thus, the agencies we create should have far greater freedom and authority to organize and direct the transformation in response to majority interests. And the third reason why I think it might be easier for us than then is that the military's inability to define its strategy and translate its munition needs into required goods and services greatly complicated the mobilization effort. They didn't know what they needed. They didn't know how to translate these things. But as opposed to the uncertainties involved in planning and conducting a war, we have a relatively good understanding of the causes of climate change and the range of actions, including their material requirements needed to restore ecological balance. That knowledge will make it far easier to plan. Now, here are the 5 reasons why I think it'll be much harder for us to make the Green New Deal style transformation than the World War II one. First, the reality of war ensured popular support for state efforts to convert the economy. Unfortunately, even now in the United States, there are a lot of people who don't believe climate change is real, and they're certainly not willing to make adjustments in their life to respond to it, which means that we have the challenge of building sustained and getting involved in sustained and massive popular education to get people to even accept and understand the nature of the crisis and the need for changing the economy to respond to it, the actual transformation. Second, this is where another reason it'll be harder. Because of the popularity of the New Deal, there was a general willingness among the population to believe in the capacity of the government to manage economic activity. That made it easier for Roosevelt to advance a state-directed wartime mobilization. And also, thanks to the New Deal experience, Roosevelt was able to call upon a number of professional economists and planners, as well as friendly business leaders, all with government experience, to fill important roles in the new mobilization agencies. Unfortunately, we face widespread popular doubts about the ability of government to solve problems, and there are relatively few progressive economists or planners with prior government experience designing or managing large-scale public programs. Third, the wartime mobilization was designed to support the needs of the military. The military's needs, in turn, were expressed through the purchasing decisions of the procurement agencies. These decisions were largely treated by mobilization agencies as marching orders. We don't have a military equivalent to drive a Green New Deal transformation. By its nature, a Green New Deal transformation will involve significant changes to many sectors of the economy, and our interest in a grassroots democratic restructuring process means there has to be popular involvement in shaping each sector's transformation, not to mention the connections between the sectors. Thus, we face the difficult challenge of creating the organizational relationships and structures required to bring together leading community representatives and produce, through conversation and negotiation, a broad roadmap of the process of transformation we seek. Fourth, big business was far weaker then than now. The Depression and New Deal policies encouraged popular distrust of their motives. Moreover, the international economic system was in tatters, with most countries employing a variety of regulatory measures to control trade and capital mobility that were further tightened during the war. Unfortunately, the world is very different now. Big corporations are celebrated as job creators, and it's the government that's distrusted. And thanks to the current freedom enjoyed by corporations to shift production and finance globally, they have a variety of ways to blunt state efforts to monitor and direct their activities. Finally, because World War II was a world war, almost all governments were forced to pursue, to some degree, the planning and regulation of their respective national economies. However, we cannot assume that the pursuit of Green New Deal transformation in the United States, for example, would be matched by similar efforts in other capitalist countries. Thus, moves in the United States to promote new Green Deal responsive investments, force firms to convert or terminate their fossil fuel dependent production, allocate materials, or manage production scheduling can be expected to produce negative responses from other governments representing their interests, the interests of their respective business leaders. So in sum, a Green New Deal transformation is certainly needed and doable, but to achieve it will be far from easy. It will require developing a broad-based effort to educate people about our ecological crisis and the role of capitalism in driving it, building a political movement for system-wide change anchored by a new ecological understanding and vision, and creating the state and community-based representative institutions needed to initiate and direct the desired transformation. It's the last challenge that makes a careful consideration of World War II era conversion of the US economy especially valuable. By studying how the rapid economic-wide transformation was achieved, we're able to gain important insights into and the ability to prepare for some of the many challenges and choices that await us on the path to the new economy we so badly need. And I will end here.
Thank you for your great presentation, Professor Hart-Landsberg. He has led the 3 economic mobilization institutions in the United States during World War II, introducing their structure, challenges, achievements, and changes. Also, some lessons have been drawn from this, namely the advantages and disadvantages of today's economic transformation. Unfortunately, in Korea, despite the presidential election to be held in 6 days, topics such as the Green New Deal are rarely covered. Today's talk seems to teach us a lot in need of ecological and economic transformation. Now, anyone who has any discussion or question on this topic, raise your hand or let me know via chat.
I could ask a question. My video is not working for the moment. Is that okay?
Yes, Professor Jaremka, please.
That was a very interesting talk, Marty. I mean, as an American, of course, I am somewhat familiar with the names and the period and so forth and so on. So that helps me a lot. I learned a lot of things that I didn't know before. I had one question, which is probably very easy for you to answer, and the other one probably much more difficult. The easy question is, I didn't hear you mention input-output economics and Leontief in your presentation. Did I miss it, or did he not play any role whatsoever, or educate us a bit about that?
Okay. Do you want to? Yeah, go on to the other one.
Yeah, the other question is probably something you haven't worked on, but it's whether you made a comparison of the US case with, say, the British case, to see if there's a pattern or differences that are worth talking about.
Thank you for those questions. Let's start with the second one. I've started doing some reading about the German mobilization, just because I came across some books that kind of grabbed my attention. And so I'm kind of looking at that. What I'm really focusing on, so that's kind of as you put it, to kind of learn from comparisons and to see different techniques. What I'm actually focusing a lot on right now is trying to get a sense of how labor, what its vision was for making the transformation different. In other words, I know that unions like the UE, United Electrical Workers, had their own vision of how to combine different companies and workers and essentially dilute corporate control over the process of making decisions about how to allocate resources and to upgrade labor's participation and direct management. And so some of those kinds of struggles are really interesting to me to think about from a progressive point of view, because one of the things that I didn't really stress a lot of, although I kind of put little flags there, is the way in which corporations were able to ally with the military and sort of sideline a lot of labor involvement. So I'm kind of both trying to, I've started with Germany and trying to study their process of mobilization, but then also look, which I'm finding it's hard to find things, but to look a little bit at how labor, CIO, and some of the unions sought to sort of change things. As to the first, to the best of my knowledge, the input-output stuff was not heavily used. I haven't gone back to reading some of Simon Kuznets' work where he was the main person. So I'm not sure quite how he made
I thought Leontief was.
Kuznets was the main person during the war period who was hired by Nathan, who was in the planning bureau in the War Production Board, to do that work, not Leontief.
Okay.
So it's a good question. I'm going to go back and look and see whether Kuznets consulted or made use of that. That was a separate development that he.
You know, the reason why I ask it is because when I would be teaching my students input-output economics, I would show them a really simple model of how to plan. And then you mentioned this victory program, which sounded like, Jesus Christ, that's what input-output economics is for. So,
yes.
Okay.
No, exactly. And yeah, very much so. I'm going to go back and see where Leontief maybe comes in, but all my reading, he's not mentioned. It's basically Simon Kuznets, who's giving accolades. Okay. And what's interesting is that in both cases, in the victory program, and then you know, in late 42, it was economists who really played a very important role of trying to bring the military to heel. And one thing I didn't mention is that after the final change in the War Production Board, when Wilson was made the head of it, one of the things he did to win military favor was he downgraded the planning bureau so the military would never have to deal with them. And the entire planning bureau resigned in mass out of anger for what was happening.
Yeah, okay. One other thing, coming back to your first point about Germany, I mean, that's fine also. I just wanted a comparison. But if you go to Germany, you're not going to be able to talk about the labor movement.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
No, exactly. Very true. So going to Britain would have more useful for the kind of changes we're interested in. It would show more possibilities and raise more interesting issues. Yeah. Good point. I've just found so many people in the environmental movement, and not just environmental movement, working on issues have lost any sense of what a full-scale system transformation would look like, to even imagine it. And it's just sort of, you know, fight for one issue and fight for another issue. And to me, what was important about doing this was to kind of bring attention to the fact that these are possible. You know, obviously, the Green New Deal is not just, you know, reduce fossil fuels, but building a different economy with different work relations, living relations. But when you start to study it, you begin to get your hands around, what are we really talking about when we talk about actually transforming an economy? And what are the kinds of strategies we need? And how should people who want wind turbines work with people who are into, you know, different agriculture and use of land? And how do we begin to build up those relationships and think about mechanisms of planning? And for a lot of people in the movement, they don't think much about the government for understandable reasons, because the government hasn't been responsive and people don't have much confidence. But if we're going to make a transformation, it seems to me that we need that kind of authority and power.
Yeah, very good.
예, 정성기
Yes,
선생님.
yes, related to the Professor Zarandukar's questions. My question, first of all, thanks very much for your very detailed and telling about the history of American wartime planning and its implications for the current climate crisis for the Green New Deal. Yeah, my question is that the reason why the U.S. Wartime planning did not refer to or did not try to get help from the Soviet planning, including the ideas of Vasily Leontiev, is that the wartime planning in America was not the whole economy-wide planning. I mean, it's a whole, it's a macro economic planning. Then we need the kind of input-output tables. But wartime planning in the United States, it's a kind of, it's a sectional. That the macroeconomic planning is a sectional, although it covers it's a crucial, critical, it's a military, it's a sectors. So that's the reason. So what do you think? So could it? I think that is the difference between the U.S. wartime planning and the Stalinist Soviet planning in the 1930s or 40s.
So first, I apologize for maybe the details, the nature of the details. It's hard in a talk, and I know for people who are not from the U.S. and aren't always familiar with the names and the processes, it must be a lot to take in. So I appreciate people's patience as I ran through all these kinds of detailed changes, which for me are the heart of trying to understand things. Sungjin, I think your point is a good one. To the extent that the input-output matrix is assuming under Soviet terms that you can control all these things and have knowledge of all these things. The planning process that happened in the war was one where the state didn't have control over all these things and knowledge of all these things. So they're seeing what the demands are and they're balancing, moving back and forth and responding to things. I could imagine an input-output table being useful in a rough sense, going back to Paul's question of just providing parameters of what an economy overall could produce. But it may well be that at that stage, the information was pretty sketchy. The military wasn't even sure what it needed. It was, the investment was expanding industries very rapidly, so it wasn't even quite clear. And it may just well have been that an input-output table would not have been serious enough because of all the uncertainties and the lack of information and the lack of control. So what they used was much more seat of the pants kind of calculations and planning, and responding then, continually changing and trying different efforts to adjust to the imbalances that were produced. So that's a good question. It's clearly an area I need to do more work on myself.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And I just remember that the Leontiev creating or the compiling the input-output tables. So I think it's the 1940s, or because his work for United States was published, I remember it's after the end of the World War II. So maybe it's the Roosevelt could not use the tables because at that time, I'm not sure.
Sorry, I just looked it up. He made his first input-output table in 1939 at Harvard.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Interesting. Well, that becomes even more interesting than what, why it wasn't used. And I'll have to go back. It's an interesting question. So I appreciate it coming up.
I will look again at this article.
One of the things that was interesting to me about issues of class struggle, I mentioned and stressed how the Defense Production Corporation created all these factories. And even though they let private business manage them, they were all owned by the government and run according to government plans. I should add that the government then said to these corporations, when the war's over, you can buy them at very cheap prices. And that was one way in which big business then ended the war even stronger, because they were able to buy at relatively cheap prices a lot of stuff. But the point that was interesting is that during the war, there are lots of interesting quotes from business leaders. One of their hesitancy about the mobilization was they were very concerned that the economy state control over the economy didn't grow. And they were very concerned that when the war ended, the US government did not have the capacities and the tools to tightly regulate and control them. So what they did is they paid for newspaper tours who would go around to the different factories and write stories saying that it was US business that was winning the war. So they go, Ford's factory producing the bombers we need, and never mentioning that most of these factories were paid for by the government, that the money came from the government owned them, and that it was the government that ensured the infrastructure and the labor and the training to make this happen. But the media willingly went along in all these tours and interviews, communicating to the public that the reason that the US won, they made it as a war of democracy versus planning. The Nazis planning, the Japanese planning. And so what won the war was democracy and private enterprise. And they engaged in a very clear, that I've read a lot of their stuff, and they were very cognizant of the fact when they were fighting the war that it was an at-home ideological struggle. And so when the war ended, again, they had solidified the sense that US free enterprise system won the war. And that suggests to us is that when we engage in these kinds of things, we can't just look at these things as technical issues and say, oh, it's just a matter of planning and getting the right things. Because what we want is restructuring the society we live in, and big capital in control of some of the production is going to resist that. And ideological struggle can, unless we're there, is going to be very one-sided and make it difficult for us to make the changes we want.
Marty, first of all, that's a very good point. I mean, to get people to understand, for example, that the government was doing it, not General Motors. I mean, okay. Coming back to Leontief, I'm looking at an article called Leontief Input-Output Model in the Real World. And the first paragraph, says he was there in third paragraph, was there in 1937 to 39 when he produced the first input-output model, which despite its primitive nature proved to be an important planning tool for World War II. For example, it showed that Roosevelt's rash promise to deliver 50,000 planes to the Allied forces was unrealistic, and the model indicated the bottleneck obstacles that must first be overcome. Now, maybe that didn't get to Kuznets, I don't know. But anyway, that's certainly, it's in line with,
No, it makes me wonder why, because I've read a lot of histories of the period. I mean, many of them, and Leontief's name never comes up. So that raises a really interesting question. I got to go back. I appreciate this insight.
네, 고민지 선생님 뭐 질문해 주시죠.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Actually, I'm not unfamiliar with Green New Deal projects, but I want to ask you some small question. I would like to know what is different between EU's green taxonomy and the new provisioning system of US Green New Deal. I think the last one needs more activate position of government, and it can make the big economical program like create jobs by government. So it means the more powerful state, but it means the hardworking mobilization is needed. And I think you are not vision that is ideal model. Then I would like to know how can we build up new balance between government and civil society and profit-making enterprises. By the way, when the ideal model is similar with EU's green taxonomy, the power balance between state, corporates, and civil society means actually is not provisioning system. And I think it's not a good model when we think about the new Green New Deal provisioning system.
Well, lots of interesting thoughts and questions there. What little I know, and I'm very ignorant, I know that the current administration in Korea put forward what's called a Green New Deal program, which has been quite limited, and the EU system is also quite limited. The difference in the US is there's nothing you can point to in the US and say that's a Green New Deal program. It's been kind of a rallying cry to unite people. So we don't have anything to even compare what other governments are doing, which are much more limited in green industry, I think. In the US, there is nothing. There was, a kind of an encouragement and a statement of principles and all sorts of differences. For example, some Green New Deal programs ignore the military, others very important. Green New Deal has been very nationalistic, focusing on changes in a particular country rather than the global Green New Deal. So if we say we're going to have, electrified cars and you need batteries, well, where is the lithium coming from? And what is it? Or if we're changing agriculture and we're main purchasers of third world, what are we doing to other countries? What about reparations? And how should our Green New Deal take into account a broader global Green New Deal? But to the heart of your question about these balances between civil society and corporations and the state, I think it's in the United States, it's a major challenge. I think people are so distrustful of government that they're even, for example, in many, I don't know how people feel in this group, but there are many, progressives say, oh, cryptocurrencies will be good because the government won't control money supply. Or small is beautiful. We'll all have, solar panels on our house and we don't need to, to think in big, broad terms. So I think there's in the same way that we have to be mobilizing people for change, I think in the United States, we have to be drawing on examples to give people a feeling for capacities. So where I live in Portland, we had kind of an interesting and I think an important small gain where we passed a tax on big retail companies that have a certain size and national global range. And the money raised goes to what's called the Portland Green Fund. And all the commissioners in Portland and the city government get to appoint someone on that fund. And that fund then uses that money to help marginal communities, communities of color, poor people, get solar panels, get trained for environmental work, create parks. So the idea is people begin to look to the government as an organizing force for raising funds, but to use those funds in ways that build capacities in communities for a response to to climate problems. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for, is to get enough local experiences where people can envision governments doing good based on raising funds from corporations, but also building the communities so that they can actually hold the government funds accountable and use. So in the United States, Paul may feel differently, but I feel like we're really way behind in doing what needs to be done. And it's not a question of what's our position towards a particular legislative proposal and how would we feel about, is nuclear power green or not? We don't even have anything that's there. So it's really an umbrella for doing politics. And the question is, what should be the content of the politics, and how do we build the principles correctly so that if crises happen here or elsewhere, we build them on a correct level. I hope that answered a little bit of your question. I'm curious, among people one of the things that got me very interested in planning was my study of the South Korean experience. When I started to study it and then wrote a book that came out in '93 about the Korean experience, at that time it was kind of standard presented among many mainstream economists as a neoliberal free market, where it was anything but an experience like that. And I wondered if, given that history, which has certainly changed, I know that things have happened and planning is very different and state capacities are different and the power of chaebol are different. But is there any among the movements kind of a sense of what that past was like and how to think and use it in terms of restructuring?
May I respond to your questions first? Yes, maybe others, Korean colleagues can talk about it. As far as I know, I don't think any of the left or progressives in Korea tries to refer to the experiences of the economic planning in the 1960s and 1970s under the Park Chung-hee regimes. So, yes, Park Chung-hee is that time. So you somewhat positively evaluate the planning of the Park Chung-hee regimes, because it did achieve extraordinary high rapid economic growth. Unlike the other rest of the third world countries, and it even for example, the input-output tables is at that time. So Korean government is compiled input-output tables, even the start of the 1960s. So and they did use the tables and the related techniques in the planning. But yes, I don't know the current Korean left or progressives. So except the So except the Janajun like developmental statist, most of the Korean left would not. There's evaluations of the Korean. I said Park Chung-hee's regime is very negative. So, but for myself, I think that planning is really needed for the Koreans, not just it's a global Green New Deal is Korean, so we can like in the same way that you did, you tried to find some lessons from the history of the American planning. So we had better come back to return to the so-called developmental state states attempt to planning. So,
thank you.
A quick question. Regarding the three organizations you introduced today, could you recommend an introductory book for non-North Americans who are not familiar with it?
Whoa, that's a good question. And I have to think about that. If I come up with a good answer, I will email you. The problem is most of what, economists in the United States have no interest in planning. They're very theoretical and their models are very abstract. And most of the work on the planning are written by economic historians who write large, 700-page books on the processes and the individuals and the minutia of priority systems. And so, they're very difficult even for me, who's familiar with the broad history and terms, but to go through and so I am not aware of a easy one to suggest to give an overview, but I will think about it. And if I can come up, if one comes to mind, I'd be happy to share. I know that there's a man named J.W. Mason, M-A-S-O-N, who's an economist who works with an organization called the Roosevelt Institute. And they've published a few papers trying to call forth some lessons from that period on the defense plant corporation and other kinds of things that are useful, they argue are useful. So it's not an overview of it all, but it would be a way in to start looking at some of the history. And I think they have 12 to 15-page little policy papers, which might be helpful. So it's J.W. Mason, M-A-S-O-N, and the Roosevelt Institute. And if you go to the Roosevelt Institute site, you'll find some of those papers, and that might be of interest.
Thank you. Is there anyone who has more discussions or questions? Okay, I think it's time to finish our talk. Thank you, Professor Hart-Landsberg, and thank you all. The next talks will be made on March 9th at 7 p.m. Seoul time by Professor Guhyeon Miller of SOAS University of London under the theme of global Trotskyism and the problem of the Korean War. Thank you.
Thank you very much.